So how does green coffee move and why is it important? If you played sports growing up, you probably heard the phrase, practice how you play. And I played baseball when I was a kid, but now that I'm an adult, there's application for this in all sorts of different areas of life. But today what we'll talk about is green coffee and how it moves. And why is it important to know how green coffee moves? What does that mean for you as a green buyer? And are there things you can learn about that can be helpful to you, not just to understand the process, but to utilize it to your advantage and to the advantage of producers as well by becoming a sophisticated green buyer? So that's what I want to talk about today is how does green coffee move and why does it matter to you? When I start working with new roasters or when I meet a roaster who is pre-revenue, oftentimes they are so excited about these amazing coffee experiences they've had, and their desire is to source 90 point or better, period, across the board. And there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but there's a couple of challenges here. There's this sort of tension that arrives because can your buyers actually articulate the difference between a 90 point coffee and a 87 point coffee? There's this concept that if I just source really high scoring coffees, people are going to fall over themselves to get to me and to drink my coffee. And I'm going to have the next insert famous roaster that you've heard of. And so I have a dilemma at that point of like, what do I tell this person? Because my intention isn't to discourage anybody away from their vision or their desire, but there is a reality of what does that mean a year from today or in 5 years from today? What does it actually mean for you to source those types of coffee? And generally speaking, for most roasters, most of the coffee that you're going to sell is going to be sub 90 points. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that's really important for us to understand. And it blew my mind when I first started working in coffee and when I started to understand, okay, well, how much volume are we selling of these really special coffees versus the sort of the house blends of the world or the dark roasts of the world or the espresso blends. And what I learned was that's what most people are buying. Just generally speaking, broad brushstrokes. There's always an exception to the rule, but generally speaking, that is what people are buying. If you're starting out and you're so focused on we only are going to source 90 point coffees or better, or what have you, what ends up happening is the people that care about those kinds of coffees, you're only as good as your last coffee, okay? And they're going to go to the next roaster that has something interesting, and they're going to buy a 12-ounce bag or an 8-ounce or 10-ounce or whatever your volume is. And then they're going to go to the next roaster and then so on and so on and so on and so on and so forth. But for you as a business, you need reoccurring revenue. You need people to buy more than once. You need people to buy every week, every month. That is what you need to build sort of a sustainable business. If you build your business off of, I have 1,000 people that buy one bag a year, it's going to be difficult to sustain it. And if that's your goal, that's your desire, that's totally fine. We're good. That's understandable why you would even take that approach. But if you're trying to build sort of a sustainable business that's going to take care of you and your family and so forth, you're probably going to have to source some different coffees. In fact, typically those crazy high scoring coffees that are more expensive than your 85 blender level coffee, those coffees are typically 10% or less of what your whole roastery serves and sells. Again, there's always an exception to the rule, but we're talking generally speaking for most roasters across the US. And so then you have to start to think through like, okay, well, what does that mean for me? And how do I start to formulate a concept of sourcing if I'm not strictly going to only focus on high scoring, high quality coffee? How do I start to build an understanding of buying coffee in an equitable way? For the sake of argument, we'll say, let's play this out fully. Let's say you start really growing and really doing some volume. Well, most producers are only able to produce a couple of bags of these really high scoring, amazing lots. Some of them are able to produce more, of course. Again, there's always exceptions to the rule. But generally speaking, if you're sourcing these like really crazy, amazing 90 plus point coffees, there's not as much of that in the world to go around. And so then if your volume goes up, now you have a gap. And so we have to start thinking through, well, how do we fulfill the needs of our customers? How do we not buy cheap coffee, but how do we buy coffee in an equitable manner that is good quality and good for the industry? And how do we not necessarily abandon our vision, but how do we expand it into what does it actually mean to source coffee? What is actually helpful to producers? Is it helpful to only buy their super high scoring lots? Or is it more helpful to say, hey, I want to buy your high scoring lots, but I also want to taste your other coffee and see, maybe we could buy all of your coffee. And that way you don't have to find a buyer for all the rest of your coffee, because most of the coffee that a producer harvests every year is not the highest scoring stuff. So if that's a reality for a producer, then how do you be a good partner and think through, is there a way that I can sell more of this producer's coffee that I really like? Is there a way that I can pay an equitable amount of money for this? Is there a way for me to move that coffee? That's the question we have to answer. And that's what I'm going to leave you with here before we jump on to this next bit with how does green coffee move? So I want you to think about that. What does it mean to source coffee in an equitable way if it's not strictly about quality? What does that mean to you? Just think through it. Just think through it. Okay, how does green coffee move? Now, I'm going to be looking over here because I'm looking at my laptop because I'm referencing my book. If you'd like to buy my book, The Owner's Manual, A Guide to Sustaining a Coffee Roaster, there'll be a link below, or you can go to my website. I have a link there, of course, where you can buy my book or buy 10. So how does green coffee move? In most countries, this is what's happening at origin. Coffee gets picked, and then typically it goes to a collection point. The collection point is going to get sorted. From there, it's going to get processed. From there, it's going to get hand sorted, like a literal person picking out, that's a defect, or that one has insect damage or what have you. Then typically it gets color sorted. Then it gets milled. Then it gets dried. Then it gets warehoused. Then it gets prepped. Then it gets loaded. Then it gets exported. Then it gets imported into the consuming country. Then it gets warehoused again. And then there's this last mile logistics where somebody's saying, hey, pull that pallet of coffee from the warehouse and ship it to my roastery. And then it lands in your roastery. So it's really important to understand what's happening. What are all those little steps in that journey from getting picked to getting roasted, so that you can start to understand, okay, if I understand this process, I could potentially add value to it, or I could understand who is adding value in that process and what sort of value are they adding to the process. I am by no means an expert on this side of the industry, but I will say that it's really important to understand how coffee does move. It will help you become a more sophisticated grain buyer, and it will help you be a better partner to the people that you're buying green coffee from, because you understand what's happening in their world. Another thing that's important to consider is ownership exchange. You've heard the term farm gate, right? So essentially, that's one of the first exchanges of ownership in coffee, meaning it's going from that was the farmer's coffee, and now it's somebody else's responsibility from there. And so there's this elaborate game of ownership exchange from the farmer all the way to the roastery, and then eventually to the wholesaler or the retailer or the retail buyer. So essentially, you can imagine that coffee's just changing hands a bunch of times from the time it's picked until the time it lands here in your roastery. And then again, ownership exchange happens another time, either if you sell it to a wholesale partner or to your retail buyer before someone actually consumes it. A long time ago, I was taking a class with a friend of mine, and he was saying that coffee typically changes hands about 30 to 40 times from the time it's picked to the time it lands in your roastery. It's really important to understand all of those hands that are involved in the process of getting the coffee from the cherry to your dock, so that you can not only tell the story, but also understand what value each of those people add to the process itself. So the real question that I will leave you with is this: what does it mean to buy coffee in an equitable way for you and your roastery I advocate for buying the same coffee year after year. There's a couple of reasons for that. And one of them is because it's consistency. If you use the same product from the same place, yes, it's going to be different year to year because it's an agricultural product. But you start to get familiar with that product. So to understand, how does it change? When does it start to fade? What is the roast profile like last year versus this year? And do you have to change anything? And you just become familiar with those products because you're using the same thing every single year, which is really exciting and really interesting. And you can find some really cool opportunities too to partner with folks and to try different things and experiment. And then also, you need reoccurring revenue to have a sustainable business, and so do the producers that you're buying from. So what does it mean for you to buy coffee in an equitable and thoughtful way? My challenge to you is to write it out. Write out, what does that mean to you? How do you think about this? It's going to be helpful to you. It's going to be helpful to your team. And it's going to help people that you're buying green coffee from put the right coffees in front of you. As always, be well.